I think fear of failure is one of those things that I have struggled the most and for the most part of my life. So in this video, after scattering the internet for advice, tips, techniques in order to overcome fear of failure, and after reading as much academic papers as I possibly could, I'm going to try to rationalize fear of failure by explaining where does it actually come from, the different categories of fear of failure, and how it impacts the lives of the people in each category. Starting with where does it actually come from, I think for me personally, when I'm dealing with a problem, the first thing I try to do is to actually understand the problem. And so majority of my research pointing out at the fact that fear of failure, for the most part, is a manifestation of our own ego. And our own ego gets affected or regulated by other metrics, such as self-belief, perception of control over outcome, perception of uncertainty, and learning focus. And I know that these all sound like big words or like complicated phrases, so I'm going to try to break them down, starting off with self-belief. Self-belief massively affects whether we feel fear of failure or not, because the less self-belief we tend to have, the more likely we are to test alternative routes when failure occurs. Hence, we end up confirming our own bias towards our perceived inadequacy. Hence, we end up having a way higher fear of failure. Additionally, the lower the self-belief, the lower the effort and perseverance we actually tend to exhibit towards the projects we are working on or the situations that actually cause us fear of failure. Hence, the possibility of actually succeeding becomes even less. And then at the end, once again, we confirm our own bias of inadequacy. Lastly, and I find that very interesting, research has also shown that people who have less self-belief, they also tend to perceive a much higher complexity of the issues they are dealing with, the issues that they are facing, and hence they increase their fear of failure because the stakes or the perceived stakes are higher overall. Next, we have the perceived control over outcomes. And this is basically how much, to which extent we believe we can avoid failure and just go straight for success. And therefore, the less perceived control we have over the outcome, the more likely we are to feel helpless, to give up, and reinforce the fear of failure. Third one is perception of uncertainty. And this ties a lot to the previous point, the perceived control over the outcomes, because basically, more often than not, what we are scared of is not failing per se, but it's just the fear of the unknown. And that is because, for the most part, society often pictures what we don't know as something negative. And so a lot of times we just feel scared towards what we don't know and not necessarily towards the outcome of our effort. And lastly, fear of failure can also be a byproduct of learning focus. And learning focus basically refers to the focus on solving problems and the ability to acquire skills in order to solve those problems. So basically the idea here is that somebody who has a very high learning focus is less likely to feel anxiety and fear of failure, simply because those people enjoy the journey towards solving the problem. They enjoy working hard. They enjoy finding new ways to approach the problem. And then even if failure actually occurs, they don't take it personally. They don't consider it their own mistake. They don't consider it a byproduct of inadequacy. It's just a data entry in the process. On the contrary, people who have low learning focus, they tend to see any failure as a judgment of their own abilities. Therefore, they end up reinforcing their fear of failure for any current or future project. And now that you have a very good understanding of where does fear of failure come from, we're going to move on to the next part, which is understanding the different types of fear of failure. In a research done by Martin et al. In 2010, the research was basically done on students, but I believe this actually applies in pretty much every aspect of life. They found out that there are two major categories of failure fearers. So in the first category, the students were dealing with fear of failure by hard work and or success, and they get categorized as the overstrivers, who are essentially very high on both failure avoidance and success orientation. And then we have the second category, which was students who were dealing with fear of failure by engaging in some more counterproductive activities. And these students got categorized as self-protectors. In the first example, the overstrivers, they experience a massive amount of anxiety. They have a very volatile self-esteem, and they also have a very low perception of control over outcome. The problem with this type of motivation is that other than the fact that the journey is unbearable, even though the results might be extraordinary, when an overstriver fails, they tend to see this as a confirmation of their perceived incompetence. And a lot of times they end up turning into the second type of failure fearer, which is the self-protector. Now, the self-protectors, they do not necessarily fear failure, but more so the implications of failure. Therefore, what ends up happening is that when failure occurs, because they don't want to see themselves as people who have low abilities, which would be the implication of failure, they end up blaming natural obstacles or challenges in the journey. For example, debilitating circumstances, the amount of effort they put into the project, procrastination, and so on and so forth. A second technique self-protectors actually use is something called defensive pessimism. And this is where basically they lower the bar to the point that the threshold for satisfactory performance is so low that they don't risk being judged as inadequate because the standard against which we judged that was very low in the first place. And at this point, I think I will actually add a third category, which I did not find in my research, but it's just a personal observation. And it's basically people who deal with fear of failure by inaction, by not doing anything at all. One of the phrases that I heard recently, and I feel like it massively impacted the way I see things, was the fact that the people who fail the most are actually the people who try the most. And although that's very comforting for my ego, it's also pretty logical, because if you think about it, if somebody applies to 100 jobs or somebody sends 100 cold pitches, this person is way more likely to fail than somebody who sent 10 or 5 or none at all. And now for the drum roll moment, how to overcome fear of failure. Number one is to set approach goals instead of avoidance goals. And I do wish I was the one who came up with that idea, but actually not. It's just years of psychology. In an article featured on Harvard Business Review, written by Susan Peppercorn, she presents the idea that a lot of times fear of failure sounds like, I am afraid of failing my exams because then I don't get to graduate. Or I am afraid of failing that job interview because then I'm unemployed. So instead of saying that, what you could say is, for example, I really want to do well because I just can't wait to graduate. Or I really want to ace that job interview because I would love to have the opportunity to work for that company. And I know it sounds small, but actually by reframing the problem to begin with, you end up massively reducing your fear of failure. Another brilliant technique is given to us by very renowned author and investor Tim Ferriss, and it's called fear setting. So basically, in this scenario, you're going to have to create two lists. The first list, you are going to list what exactly is it that you're afraid of, what is it that you can do to prevent it, and what are you going to do if worse comes to worse and you actually do fail. So to make that a little bit more understandable, let's take an example where you're saying, I want to lose weight. Your list would look like, your first list would look like, in the first column you would say, I want to lose weight and I am afraid that I'm going to fail. On your second column, which is your prevention column, you would say, in order to prevent this from happening, I'm going to exercise X times per week, I'm going to eat healthy, I'm going to sleep 8 hours every day, and so on and so forth. And then on your repair column, you are going to write, for example, if I actually fail, then I'm going to find another nutrition plan that is better aligned to my needs. I am going to change the workout that I do and find something that is more fulfilling and easier to stick to. I'm going to find a friend to work out with, so I have an accountability partner. And so this way, you have a plan on what you're going to do if you actually fail. And then you're going to create a second list, which is your inaction list. And then basically in this list, you want to write down very clearly how is your life going to be affected if you actually do nothing. And on that list, you're going to have to write every single aspect of your life, financially, personally, socially, anything that you can think of. So if we take again the example that we used before about losing weight, in that list, you would say, if I do nothing, then I might have issues with my health. I might have issues with my friends because I cannot follow on every activity that they might be doing. I might be having problems with my self-esteem. Anything that you can think of, you just write it down on that list. Then you take those two lists and you have to rate how much pain you feel looking at each list. So for example, how much pain would you feel if you tried to lose weight and you failed? And how much pain would you feel if you did nothing and you remained as you are? Then you're going to compare those two lists and this should give you the answer. Why? Because, put in simply, if the pain of doing nothing is considerably more than the pain of trying, failing, and then repairing it, then you shouldn't have that much fear of failure, because this is the moment where you realize that the worst case scenario isn't to fail. The worst case scenario is what you're going through right now. And if you compare those two lists and the pain point is just pretty much the same, then you also shouldn't feel that much fear of failure, because this is the moment that you realize that your current situation isn't that bad at all. And if you try and you fail, then that doesn't leave you in a miserable situation. Next advice is not by someone who's famous, some acclaimed writer or personality, but it's just from my own personal experience. So I would like to start by saying that whilst I do believe that the sky is the limit and that you should always dream big, I honestly feel like there is no shame in failing. And this is something that I struggle with myself. But when I actually think about it, at the end of the day, even if you fail, you are better off than what you started, because the process of trying itself is going to teach you so many skills, and it's probably going to give you so many opportunities that you have never even imagined. I know this has been true for my own life, and I'm certain you can also find examples in your life that you started something, you had goal X, that goal didn't actually come true, but you just found your passion somewhere along the way. You met amazing people somewhere along the way. You were presented with some opportunities that you wouldn't have been presented otherwise. The second thing is that I believe it's time for us to collectively stop villainizing the concept of failure. And I believe we can also collectively blame school for that. I think all we ever learn at school is that you have to be the A student, you have to be the best student, there's no room for mistake, there's no room for failing, failure is bad, and so on and so forth. And I know this has been my experience. I was always the A type of student, the kind of student that showed up, did their best, was always super motivated. I was super sad and I was taking everything personally when I didn't have the results I was looking for. And I just think this is not just bad for our mental health, but it's also counterproductive. Because if we look at it historically, there has never been a breakthrough thanks to success. Failures, challenges, obstacles, adversities are things that actually help us evolve, because a failure doesn't necessarily show us that we shouldn't be doing the thing altogether, but more likely that this is not the right way to be doing the thing. That being said, sometimes also failure shows us what we shouldn't be doing altogether, and that's great too. The other day I was listening to a speech by Eckhart Tolle, and he was basically saying that when he was fresh out of universities, one of the first things he did was to apply for a job as a banker in the city of London. And thankfully, he was actually rejected from that job, because that rejection or that failure allowed him to later on become one of the most celebrated writers and spiritual leaders. Lastly, one thing that I also say to myself quite often is that I think we should start looking at failure on the long term. Coca-Cola grossed only $50 on the first year in the market. It took Melanie Perkins, the founder of Canva, over 100 no's before she got her first investment. It took Facebook, more than 5 years to reach profitability. These and so many more examples should show us and convince us that a failure today is not still yet a failure in a year from now or 2 years from now, and that in fact you only need to get it right once. And lastly, something I try to remind myself is that even if you do fail when you try to manage your fear of failure, then that's okay too, because the more you go through your fear and the more you learn to live with it and go through it, you actually have proof of concept. You have proof that all of those things, or majority of those things that you were so afraid of, never actually happened, and that at the end of the day you can never fail if you don't quit. If you like this video, then please don't forget to subscribe. You can find in the bio the links to all my socials and all my resources, and please let me know in the comments if this was helpful and other issues that you would like me to do my magic research on and present to you on my next video. Once again, thank you for watching, and I will see you on my next video.